Hey everyone, my name is Andy, and in this series of videos I'm going to cover the tables out of each chapter from the NSCA's Essentials for Strength Training and Conditioning 4th edition. And just as it sounds, we're going to cover each table in a little bit of detail to add the extra context that you would probably need to fully understand those chapters and to be able to translate that to a test or an exam-like scenario if this is a certification that you were trying to pursue. So moving forward, here's the introduction to this video. The key points are basically the parts of the chapter that I would recommend you reading to understand the things I'm going to detail out of this chapter or these tables. And so you'll have a little familiarization with the terminology that I'll use, first of all, and second of all, when you get to that point of where the reading doesn't exactly meet the theory, that's another reason why I'm doing these videos, is just to really cross-blend that context. So here's the key points. The next thing is that there's only 2 tables from this chapter, so I've had to add a little extra documentation or slides technically to give you a better perception on what they mean. But nonetheless, it would behoove you to read these sections prior to watching this video, or if you want to watch this video and then read the chapter and then re-watch the video, that's cool too. Okay everyone, here's table 1.1. It's off of page 10 out of the textbook. It basically gives you the columns and the rows of the different fiber types and the characteristics. So what I want to do is really just kind of cover type 1 and briefly discuss type 2, and then hopefully the type 2A will just kind of give you an aha moment. But when we look at it, I kind of want to look at this a little differently than what's displayed. This is directly out of the book, so I can't change that. I did type up the table 1.2, but I still wanted to maintain its integrity. The reason why I want to start with the second to the bottom is the fiber diameter, and basically it's going to give us the basis for the rest of this discussion. So you look at the type 1 and it gives you a small, type 2A gives you the intermediate or medium, and then type 2X gives you a large diameter. So I have a graphic here in the next couple of slides that'll kind of display some of that, and you can bounce back and forth between these slides to kind of help paint a bigger picture. But that's going to set the discussion here, right? So you have a small muscle fiber. Now let's look at the fiber diameter in comparison to the motor neuron size. Now the motor neuron is also part of the axon is still part of the motor neuron. You got to think about the axon size as well, which correlates to the diameter or fiber diameter as well. So we look at the motor neuron size is small, and so obviously the type 1 versus the type 2, the type 2s will be much larger in the neuron size, which means it has to generate more force, it has to generate more action potentials to create that force and power. So the type 1 doesn't have a fiber or a motor neuron large enough to create that type of force, but it's more continuous too. So it's smaller frequencies, or weaker frequencies should I say, but it's more consistent and more persistent impulses. So we move down to the next several rows here, like nerve conduction velocity and contraction speed. And you see that on the type 1 fiber, it mentions slow, the type 2s are fast. So that's how you take the type 1 synonymously as a slow twitch fiber, and the type 2A and type 2X are your fast twitch fibers. What's important there is that some people may not understand the difference between nerve conduction velocity and contraction speed. Some people may see that as the same thing, but contextually they're different. The nerve conduction is essentially the connection from your brain to the body, where it releases the saltatory conduction, the sodium-potassium exchange. Again, the size of the neuron diameter relates to how fast and how many millivolts that creates. But the contraction speed is what happens after the signal is received at the muscle. And so, again, slower type 1 fibers, more endurance free, cutting or skipping down a couple of rows. it's a greater endurance capacity, mainly because it does remain resistant to fatigue, comparable to the type 2 fibers, where they fatigue out way faster than your endurance muscles type, or endotype, should I say. Again, we talked about force production and power production. That's low on the type 1 side, but on the type 2 side, they're going to be much higher. The endurance is going to be higher and the lower on the type 2X. You know, obviously, when you say type 2X, you're using a muscle fiber that's probably going to do something like a 50 to 100 meter sprint. You are doing a 1 to 2 rep max bench, squat, deadlift, any of those core lifts. That's where the big change from the endurance type fiber, where you're going on like a 2, 3, 4 mile run, marathon, going on a longer swim, that concept, and that's how you break down the muscle fiber types there. All right, so it makes sense that the type 1 would have more aerobic enzymes like PCG1 alpha, where it propagates the hormones to create more autoregulation and mitochondrial density, and it generates angiogenesis, where you create more capillary beds. So it all makes sense to have that group together, right? And so what else on the other side there with the type 2 fibers, the anaerobic enzyme, like your mTOR complex, or IGF-1, where those are going to be much higher, doing those types of all-out lifts and making sure you're hitting the right volumes. That'll be another chapter down the road where we talk about rep capacities and sets. But here you kind of look at it too, and you can also look at the color. Again, this is meant to kind of brush over the tables here, but color red, generally red because it's highly oxygenated. And then you have the white muscle fibers, which are a little less oxygenated than the red fibers because of the demand on oxygen itself. So this is what I'm affectionately calling pearls of wisdom from the NSCA. Underneath the table 1.1, you'll see this little radical looking thing with orange, and it has this little statement enclosed in it. The other table has a couple of those as well, but this is basically where to add that extra context or the defining manner behind the table itself. So this is the pearl of wisdom for table 1.1. Motor units are composed of muscle fibers with specific morphological and physiological characteristics that determine their functional capacity, right? So going into morphological, we're also talking about the fiber size. It morphologically, quote unquote, I have air quotes going there, means that your type 1 fibers are smaller compared to the type 2 fibers, which will be much larger. Now they have physiological characteristics, and this is kind of a good concept to think about note cards, is a physiological characteristic would be the conduction speed or the contraction speed or velocity. Those are the type, like if you go back to a 1.1 and you have a card that states morphological characteristics of type 1 muscle fibers, this is where you would write it down. Cross-reference it in that manner. Now here's an infographic that I created based off of the stuff I could find on PowerPoint. Kind of helps relate to the previous concept of fiber size and force production. Again, so if you refer back to table 1.1, you're looking at those characteristics. You can see that the fiber types, right, the blue and the purple and the green, I like how they color coded it, but I would have preferred different sizes, right, because it says type 1 fibers, early contraction. Basically, the onset of the contraction, within a split second, your muscle will signal back to the brain and say, well, I need more work, I need my buddies to pop up and help me lift this weight. Or same concept if you're sprinting, you know, within that split second, the type 1 fibers will signal back and say, all right, well, we need to generate more force to do this action. Can you send back up? And that's basically what happens here. So that's half the reason why I put these two slides side by side, mainly because you see on the right picture, the force production under the recruitment threshold. And as the recruitment threshold gets higher and higher, the force production also gets higher and higher. So think of it that way as well. So when you're looking at your study material, or if you're looking at the material in the textbook, and if you're trying to relate it professionally, that's the best way to do it. Okay, now here's the recreated table 1.2, which is found on page 11. Basically, it is such a big graph or chart that this is the best way to really show it, and hopefully that you're capable of reading it at the same time. So note that this is table 1.2 from the textbook. It's relative involvement of muscle fiber types in sport events. And so since this is the NSCA CSCS textbook, we're calling every participant an athlete here. So excuse me. So let's look at the event. We're only going to cover a couple of these, mainly because we want to keep the correlation simple. So you look at the 100-meter sprint. Let's look at the fiber type involvement there. So you look at low type 1 fiber involvement, because again, you're doing a sprint. Those type 1 fibers will be part of the initiation of the contraction, but they're going to rapidly sit there and state, well, we need the type 2 to kick in so we can make the sprint much faster. Thus, the brain to body connection becomes essential or very important. Olympic lifting is another correlative one there, because again, it's an anaerobic activity. No matter how many reps you think you're doing, it's still an anaerobic style exercise. The capacity for type 1 fibers becomes low, and then again, they signal for the fast twitch or the type 2 muscle fibers to kick in. Then another good one we could talk about is baseball or handball or volleyball. Excuse me. I'm just getting over a little chest cold. The low involvement because they are what's considered power sports. Golf is a power sport, right? No one ever really thinks of golf as a power sport. So you got to look at these baseball. You know, you could say that the guy's chunky, whatever. You know, it's still a power sport. The baseball is flying at 95 miles per hour. That isn't done through primarily type 1 muscle fibers. You're not swinging the bat to counter the speed and to resist the speed of the baseball. So those are power sports. Think of it that way. Power sports will have the low type 1 muscle fiber involvement, whereas they'll have a more basis for the type 2. But let's look at a couple of these, right? Downhill skiing, the rowing, the wrestling and boxing. Each of those, as you can see, are a high. So what are we thinking there, right? So if low and high are meant to be the black and white for type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, when you see a high, that's got to be the muscle fiber in between there, the type 2A, which is the intermediate muscle group or the hybrid muscle group, depending on the material you're sourcing there. The type 2A has a higher capacity for aerobic enzymes compared to the type 2X fibers, but much lower than the type 1. So that's where you get the type 2A fiber conduction. And that's where the brain has to relate its own impulses or thresholds for those type muscle fiber contractions or activities. And similar to table 1.1, here's the pearls of wisdom for table 1.2. The force output of a muscle can be varied through change, or delta, in the frequency of activation of individual motor units, or a change in the number of activated motor units. So you're looking at a couple of things there. Like, key phrase there is going to be the activation of individual motor units, or a change in the number of activated motor units. So when we look at individual motor units, obviously you're looking at more refined motor activity, more type 1 fiber type of involvement with walking. Those are more individual basis, whereas like the change in number of activated motor units, i.e. going to sprint, so the brain's generating more force impulse or more neural impulses to activate the motor units to signal the muscle to rapidly contract at a greater rate. And so the second one here, proprioceptors, are specialized sensory receptors that provide the central nervous system with information needed to maintain muscle tone and perform complex coordinated movements. So when we say muscle tone, we're not talking about you flexing in a mirror and seeing how toned you are. We're talking about the tone, or the sound wave technically, between the brain and the body being open or closed. So if it's open, kind of like the vagal system has a constant tone from the brain to the body, that's basically the definition of muscle tone. So we look at this statement, and again, I hope you've read the chapter up until this point, and so there are specialized sensors like your muscle spindles and your Golgi tendon organs, where the muscle spindle detects the absolute change in stretch, and the GTOs are the amount of force contracted. And so basically they have different definitions that goes into what they signal the brain to do, to either contract the antagonist muscle group or to relax the stretch. So again, read the chapter and understand those definitions, and understand what the different proprioceptors and proprioception are involved with. And here's a reference slide predicated upon the previous slides on this chapter itself, minus that one graph I pulled together. And Travis Triplett, she was the primary author for this chapter and had extra contributions from these two gentlemen here. But nonetheless, this is the slide that keeps my butt out of the fire when it comes to, referencing correctly. And with that, this concludes the introduction to Chapter 1 and the tables associated with it. If you liked it, feel free to hit the like button, leave a comment at the bottom if you have any questions. Hopefully I'll get a signal that says, hey, respond to me, please. Or if you just want to say this was crap or it was a good video, feel free to leave that as well. Hit the subscribe button and hit the bell icon for the next videos to be submitted here. When you do that, that's actually how us YouTubers get paid. You're not forking out any money, you're just helping me get paid. So help, like, share, create a little bit of a digital footprint for me, and that'll help me generate more of these videos, and it'll also help me generate a little income for my family too. So that'd be great. Thanks.